We know that, well, we thought that fluids from a sick person can cause disease, like coughing and sneezing. It's definitely an assumption made by the vast majority, including myself and yourself at some point in time, and we've never crossed our mind to even question that. Why should we be starting to question that worldview now?
Well, that's the claim. The claim is that when sick people come in contact with healthy people, they spread something. At this current time, the currently accepted model is that it's a germ that's spread between people. That is the claim. Yet, when scientists and researchers and doctors have attempted to do this, getting sick people in a group, putting them in a room with healthy people, and exposing them to one another in all kinds of ways, every way imaginable, getting them to sleep in the same bed, cough in each other's faces, spit in each other's mouths, draw blood from a sick person and inject it into a healthy person, taking snot from sick people and syringing it into their eyes and ears and mouth and nose and injecting it subcutaneously, intravenously, intramuscularly. They tried every single way to make healthy people sick, and they really, really struggled. They never convincingly demonstrated that this was how colds and flus would pass between people. So, if that's the claim, yet the evidence when they tried to do it doesn't support that claim, we've got a problem here.
Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host Audra Starkey. Today my guest is Daniel Roytas, who for over a decade worked as a lecturer and senior lecturer at various educational institutions across Australia. And during this time he taught nutritional and naturopathic medicine to thousands of college and university undergraduate students whilst working in his own clinical practice. In 2020, Daniel launched an online portal titled Humanly with the intention of delivering high-quality online professional development courses targeted toward practitioners with an interest in natural medicine. Despite feeling that something was desperately wrong in the field of health and wellness, he could never quite put his finger on it. However, after interviewing various doctors and scientists on the Humanly podcast, many of his suspicions were confirmed. As Daniel became confronted with the harsh reality that everything he thought he knew about the human body, medicine, nutrition and naturopathy was wrong, he became determined to find the truth, which required him to let go of more than 15 years of knowledge he had acquired over his years of education and in clinical practice. Over the last 4 years in particular, Daniel has come to a completely newfound understanding about health and wellness, which he now shares with like-minded people from across the world, and culminated in the recent publication of his book, Can You Catch a Cold? Untold History and Human Experiments, which contains over 1,000 references. I have to say, this has to be one of the most profound interviews I have done since first launching this podcast many years ago. So I really hope you enjoy it and find it as fascinating as I did. Alrighty, so thank you so much for joining me today, Daniel. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Audra. I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you.
Yeah, gosh, yeah, I am definitely really looking forward to this discussion because, obviously we're going to be challenging a bit of a long-held belief around the assumption that, colds and flus can be caught. But first and foremost, congratulations on the launch of your book, under the title, Can You Catch a Cold? Massive congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a long time coming, and as we were talking about just before we went on air, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of research, and many hands involved in this book. And it's great to see it finally get published and to see it doing so well. I'm really glad that there's been a lot of interest and support with the book. So let's see where it goes from here.
Yeah. I mean, the level of research that has gone in is probably what has blown me away the most. It's extraordinary. So yeah, I'm sure that I think it's probably many people reading it can appreciate that same sort of thing as well. But For a lot of our listeners, the concept of can we catch a cold sounds like a bit of a crazy question, because most of us are going to react, and I would ordinarily 5 or so years ago, by, of course we can catch a cold. That's what a ridiculous question. But based on the research in your book, there seems to be a lot more to this topic than we've been told. But before we dive into this topic and the questions, Daniel, would you mind sharing a little bit about your journey and how you came to writing the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent over 10 years lecturing as a lecturer and then senior lecturer at various colleges and universities around Australia in the field of natural medicine and nutrition and herbal medicine. And early 2020, I came across some medical doctors talking about this idea that you can't catch a cold. And I thought, this is really interesting because I've been exposed to this idea previously. I actually learnt about this idea that you can't catch illness in my undergraduate degree. So when I was going through my bachelor degree, it was an immunology lecture we were doing, and they introduced this concept to us of obviously the germ theory, but then this contrary perspective known as the terrain theory, where disease is earned, not caught. So when I heard the doctors talking about this in early 2020, it immediately resonated with me. And obviously being in the position I was as a lecturer and doing lots of public speaking and presenting for associations and institutions and things like this, I thought this question is definitely going to come up given we're in the middle of a pandemic. So I better have a look at this and be able to answer the questions when they come in. So I started looking at the research to see if there were any human experiments that were done trying to make healthy people sick by putting them in close contact with sick people. And I started developing quite a repository of information, and a colleague of mine who's written a fantastic book, Roman Bystrianic, who wrote a book called Dissolving Illusions, contacted me and said, hey man, I know you've got like all these papers, all these experiments that you found, you should really put this into a book, talking about this idea that you may not be able to catch a cold. And that was where it started. That's where it all kicked off. So that was early 2020, and I've continually researched and read thousands of papers and spent a lot of time re-educating myself on this perspective that I had held for most of my life, and am now at the point where I'm getting out there and sharing the information that I've found with people like yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing, that you, I guess, humble enough to realize that maybe everything that I thought to be true and what I've taught isn't. Let me just have a bit of an open mind to this situation and investigate further. So we know that, well, we thought that fluids from a sick person can cause disease, like coughing and sneezing. It's definitely an assumption made by the vast majority, including myself and yourself at some point in time, and we've never crossed our mind to even question that. Why should we be starting to question that worldview now?
Well, that's the claim. The claim is that when sick people come in contact with healthy people, they spread something. At this current time, the currently accepted model is that it's a germ that's spread between people. That is the claim. Yet, when scientists and researchers and doctors have attempted to do this, getting sick people in a group, putting them in a room with healthy people, and exposing them to one another in all kinds of ways, every way imaginable, getting them to sleep in the same bed, cough in each other's faces, spit in each other's mouths, draw blood from a sick person and inject it into a healthy person, taking snot from sick people and syringing it into their eyes and ears and mouth and nose and injecting it subcutaneously, intravenously, intramuscularly. They tried every single way to make healthy people sick, and they really, really struggled. They never convincingly demonstrated that this was how colds and flus would pass between people. So if that's the claim, yet the evidence when they tried to do it doesn't support that claim, we've got a problem here.
Yeah, definitely. After obviously reading through your book, I'm a bit more familiar with the research, but I do remember you as one of your students when I was studying. There was a pivotal, thought-provoking moment that you gave me when you asked us along the lines of, just because research is old, does it make it relevant? And my initial thoughts to that yeah, because research can get forgotten over time and overtaken by a new study, the latest research, and so forth. But that's exactly what happened for yourself, wasn't it? That you really did go back not just 10, 20 years when it came to researching this topic.
Yeah, I went to the start. But I think you said just because research is old doesn't make it relevant. I think you meant irrelevant.
Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
And you're right. Just because research is old doesn't make it irrelevant. So I went back to the very start to answer this question of whether or not you can catch a cold. And 1900s, early 1900s is when they started to do these human transmission experiments. And they never once demonstrated that infectious microorganism, a germ, a virus, a bacteria, whatever they want to call it, in the fluids of a sick person makes a healthy person ill. They never demonstrated that. They never demonstrated this concept of contagion. And yes, those experiments are old, but about the 1950s, 1960s, ethics committees started coming into play. And you could no longer do these kinds of experiments because they were considered unethical. The concept is very simple. Sick person, healthy person, put them together. Does a healthy person get sick? They did these experiments. They didn't get sick. So it doesn't matter how old the experiments are. It disproves that theory. And actually, those experiments, even though they are old, they hold more weight. They are far more valuable now for the very fact that we can't do those experiments anymore. So we're lucky that we had the opportunity to do them when we did. And this was done by governments around the world. It was done by the United States Health Department. It was done by the United States Navy. It was done by medical institutions and universities and governments all around the world. They attempted to demonstrate this phenomenon, but they couldn't do it. And that flies in the face of this idea that you can catch a cold. And despite decades and decades and decades and hundreds of attempts just with colds and flus to make people sick, they could never demonstrate this. But that research is never spoken about. No one ever hears about this research. And I certainly didn't in any of my years and years and years of study and reading textbooks on immunology and infectious diseases and all these kinds of things. This information was never presented to me. And I'm not sure if you ever heard of it before either, but when you go back and start looking at these things, it's really confronting because it challenges everything that we've been taught and everything that we think we know about colds and flus.
Yeah, it puts everything on a bit of a backflip, doesn't it? I think back on my whole microbiology class now, and I'm going, not so sure. But then we kind of have to think of, well, where did that lecturer learn what he knows? Maybe because he listened to some other lecturer, and where did that lecturer learn what they did? And you're like, it just kind of keeps going back and back and back. So how about for people listening, they're going to go, well, Daniel, but how can you explain then if people are within a room or they're within a workplace and they get exposed to somebody that's not well and they end up getting sick? Can you explain that sort of phenomenon that we're kind of used to hearing?
Yeah, I mean, it may be, there are other explanations for this. So common environmental exposure is one thing. The nocebo effect, social contagion is another. Mind viruses, the power of belief, the nocebo effect, as we've mentioned, mass psychogenic illness. These are all possible explanations. Meteorological changes in the environment, the air temperature, the humidity, that can all have an effect on groups of people when they can experience similar responses to those common environmental conditions. People will argue that point. They will say, but we see this happening. We see sick people and healthy people come together and the healthy person gets sick. But the fact of the matter is they did the controlled experiments. They did them. And it didn't happen. Nothing happened. Like this, the Common Cold Research Unit in Salisbury in England, they did research for 5-6 decades, maybe 50 years, maybe a little bit less. And they did these experiments. Like they went as far as finding an abandoned island in the Hebrides. And it had old dwellings on it, and they put a bunch of healthy people on that island for 3 months in complete isolation, so they had no exposure to anyone from the outside world. And then they got a bunch of sick people with colds and put them on the island. They went and lived with those people in their homes. They coughed and sneezed and did all kinds of things. They spat on their forks, and the healthy people ate food from their forks and licked their cups and all sorts of things. But people didn't get sick. So even though we want to say, I see someone in an area of a vicinity of a sick person get sick, therefore something's transmitting, when they did it in controlled environments, they couldn't demonstrate it. So it shows that there's something else going on here. Now, as I said, there's many alternative explanations. One of these is the nocebo effect. This is incredibly powerful. The nocebo effect is the antithesis to the placebo effect. So a positive outlook or a positive perspective or belief about something elicits a beneficial or positive response in the body. Similarly, a negative belief or perspective or outlook on something can cause a negative effect in the body. In some of these experiments, they took people, healthy people, and told them that they were exposing them to germs. And within a matter of hours, those people developed colds and flus. They were up all night coughing and spluttering and sneezing and feverish and sweating and all sorts of things. All these typical symptoms we would associate with a cold and a flu. And the next morning, the nurse comes into the room and says, "Gotcha. We didn't expose you to germs. We exposed you to saline. We just told you that we..." And within an hour, the symptoms went away. So just the belief alone was enough to cause the symptoms of a cold and flu. And this is across the board. This nocebo and placebo effect is not just for colds and flus. They've demonstrated that people can lose their hair and get nausea and vomiting and experience side effects of chemotherapy when they're told that they've been exposed to chemotherapy treatments, but they were only ever given saline, right? So we know that this is a wide range of symptoms that people can manifest just with the power of belief alone. So now let's take that idea of this nocebo effect and apply it to real life. What happens to all of us from the day we can basically understand the words that are coming out of our parents' mouths? Stay away from the sick child or the sick person because they're going to make you sick. So we get this idea drummed into us day after day, after flu season, after year after year after year, by doctors and teachers and parents and people in authority. And inevitably, one day, we come in contact with a sick person and we ourselves get sick, and it confirms this story that we've been told, that, oh, mum and dad must have been right because I got sick when I came in contact with the sick person. Therefore, germs. And we then take that idea forward with us for the rest of our lives. So that idea is, we hold it in such high regard. It's so ingrained into who we are as a person that next time we come in contact with a sick person, is it possible that our belief alone is enough to manifest these symptoms because we believe that is true and that's the way that things work. So like this is one example of how people might get colds and flus when they come in contact with sick people. And of course, as I mentioned, there's many, many other ways as well.
Actually, I remember, it's amazing how you can remember snippets of your childhood. I think I must have been about 5 or 6, and there was a smallpox outbreak of something supposedly going around. And I remember Mum dropping me off at this house to be exposed to all these other kids so that I would get ill. And oddly enough, I didn't get sick. And, as time marched on, didn't really think more about it until I was about 21. And I did end up getting chicken pox or whatever it was. And I was fiercely sick. But looking back now, it was at a point where my diet was horrendous and I was under a huge amount of stress, emotional stress at the time. So, was I necessarily exposed to something, or was it something else kind of going on? So what you're just pinpointing out certainly makes sense. And I think there was another something that you mentioned in the book too. I think around mercury exposure and being thought of also as an infectious disease. Can you share us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there are, and just for the listeners at home, they've also done experiments with chickenpox too, where they put people with chickenpox in rooms with healthy people, and for the sake of the conversation, a very, very, very small percentage of people got chickenpox. We're talking like 2 or 3% of people here. And I think they did this is going back a while, so I'd have to look at the paper, but this was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that they did this with, 500-600 people over many years. Children, they tried to do this and they couldn't make them sick. So that was like person-to-person exposure. But they've also then gone a step further and taken the body fluids and exposed healthy people to people who've got chickenpox, and they couldn't make them sick. They literally cut the chickenpox scabs off people's arms and bodies and cut holes in other people's arms and stuffed the chickenpox lesions inside their arms, and they didn't get chickenpox. So they've tried and tried and tried and tried, and they can't demonstrate this theory of contagion. So not just for colds and flus, but for chickenpox. Now, you mentioned about mercury exposure. So people say, how do you explain seeing groups of people fall ill one after another with the same symptoms in the same location? It must be contagious. They thought scurvy was contagious. The reason they thought scurvy was contagious was because on a ship, one sailor would start having his teeth fall out and his gums would bleed and he'd start bruising easily and he'd go into respiratory failure and heart failure and he'd get muscle wasting and end up dying. And then the next guy it would happen to, and the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy. And after a couple of months, the whole ship's affected. And they thought, oh, this must be a spreading infectious disease. They thought the same with beriberi. They thought the same with pellagra. They used to quarantine people and do all kinds of things to them and restrict their human rights and treat them like animals because they thought pellagra was a contagious illness. This is as recent as the 1930s, 1940s. They thought this. And then we've also got common environmental exposure to things like mercury and various other toxins. So in the 1950s, I think it was, in Minamata in Japan, there was an outbreak of what they thought was infectious meningitis. One person presented to the hospital with these peculiar neurological symptoms. And within a few days, some more people presented, and then more people, and more people, and more people, until hundreds of people in the town had presented to the hospital with this illness. They thought it must be a spreading, contagious illness. And they worked out that a local company had dumped like 30 tons of methyl mercury. They were a fertilizer production manufacturing facility. They dumped 30 tons of mercury into the bay. And people were eating the fish and the shellfish and the sea life from the bay. and they were getting mercury poisoning. And even when the authorities came out and said, hey, we were wrong, it wasn't an infectious illness, we're sorry, it's actually mercury poisoning, we've discovered this. The people in the surrounding villages were so scared they continued to believe that it was infectious. So they stayed away from the people in Minamata and ostracized them. I mean, that's the 1950s, 1960s, but even as recently as 2017, there's a report published as a case study in the medical literature where 3 children were taken to a hospital with symptoms that were diagnosed initially as scarlet fever and strep throat.
Mm-hmm.
They were given antibiotics and sent home. Their symptoms continued to get worse. So the mother took them to another emergency department for a second opinion. And it turns out that they were actually poisoned by mercury. So they were playing with a vial of mercury. It fell on the floor, broke open, and went into the carpet. And the mother came along and vacuumed up the carpet and dispersed and aerosolized this mercury into the air. The children were exposed to that. It appeared, and even in this medical paper, they're saying how mercury mimicked an infectious disease. So it appeared to be spreading between these children. But in fact, they were all exposed to a common environmental toxin. So again, there are many, many, many examples throughout history where we were confused with an environmental exposure to something and a contagious illness. And that's a problem, because what happened was people got delayed treatment with this single tunnel vision on germ theory. And it must be a germ, it must be a virus, it must be a bacteria. This happened for pellagra and berry. I think Robert Koch went to the Japanese and said, beriberi is an infectious disease. They spent decades looking at beriberi as an infectious disease, when in fact it wasn't. So they wasted time. People were delayed treatment. Those children who were said to have scarlet fever and strep throat had delayed treatment because they were misdiagnosed. And they ended up with permanent damage. So this idea is possible to cause harm because we're misdiagnosing people and attributing a cause to something based on an effect that we see. So we see the illness and go, oh, it must be infectious, when in fact it's not. So yeah, these are great examples of how we can become confused between common environmental exposures and so-called contagious illnesses.
I mean, it certainly raises the whole question about differential diagnosis, doesn't it? Which doesn't seem to have happened when there's this one laser focus, as you say, must be germ. It's like, but hang on, maybe it isn't. And I suppose it is hard for those ingrained beliefs to unwind a little bit, to think actually it might be something else. So I just want to go back a little bit, because you a good part in your book is you dive down the topic of viral isolation, because in order to be able to, as you say, prove something gets transferred from X to Y, you've got to be able to have that actual thing or that virus to prove that. So it was quite fascinating, the research in your book, how they've previously thought to isolate this virus, but they tend to, the whole process is quite a bit controversial because they seem to add so much stuff into the sample. Can you share a little bit more about that with us?
Yeah, so I first want to say that I'm not a virologist. I don't claim to be a virologist. But I do understand the scientific method. And once you understand the scientific method, you can apply that to any experiment and see if it was followed. Now, just for the record, I actually consulted a virologist and microbiologist to act as subject matter experts and to review my book to make sure that the information I was putting out specifically for that section in the book on virus isolation was true and correct and accurate. So I think that's an important distinction to make, because people may dismiss what I'm saying because I don't have the qualification, even though that's, sort of a logical fallacy. It's irrelevant as to my qualifications. It's actually, what is a scientific method and was it followed? To put this really simply, because I don't really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it all, because we could spend an hour talking about that. if you want to say that X causes Y, you have to show that X exists in nature first. You have to show that the thing exists. So let's say someone makes a claim that chocolate cakes cause, when you eat a chocolate cake, it causes a cold or a flu, let's say, right? And let's say this is at a time before chocolate cakes have ever been, like no one's ever made a chocolate cake before. Now, they claim, yeah, chocolate cakes in nature, when you come across a chocolate cake out there, when you're walking around outside and you eat it, you get a cold or flu. And I say, but chocolate cakes they don't exist in nature. And then someone goes, well, yeah, they do, because I can make one. I get some flour, I get some chocolate, I get some milk, and I put it in a bowl and I mix it up and I put it in an oven for an hour and I bake it. Here's a chocolate cake. It exists in nature. There's a problem with that because the chocolate cake was a man-made substance, right? We can't say that in a natural environment, in a natural setting, chocolate cakes cause colds and flus because someone's had to physically make it in a kitchen to demonstrate that it causes an issue. Now, this is what happens with virology. They create a substance in a lab and attribute it as a virus. They call it a virus and expose it to people, and they get non-specific symptoms. And they say it must have been the virus that we made in the lab that did it. So that's fine. You can do that, but you have to show that the virus exists in nature first, because that is the claim, that viruses floating out there, occurring in nature naturally, infect us and cause illness. So you have to show that it exists first. Where are these viruses? Well, they're in the bodily fluids and the respiratory tract of people, yada, yada, yada. No one's ever seen a virus in a mucus sample before. No one's ever seen a virus in a human being. The only time they see them is after virologists follow a recipe in a lab and mix all kinds of stuff together in a petri dish or a culture flask. And then they see particles, say it's a virus, and then expose that man-made substance to people. They squirt it up their noses and they get some sniffling and a bit of fatigue and they say, yeah, see, viruses cause disease. So they don't control for any of those steps in the lab. So first of all, they never show that the virus exists in nature. They never show that it's in a human being. They also never control for each of the steps along the way in their scientific experiments to demonstrate that their methodology, procedures, and the instruments and substances that they're using in these experiments aren't confounding the results and creating the thing that they're looking for. They're making a chocolate cake and saying that chocolate cakes exist in nature. So there's a big problem there. Now, they say that they have to create viruses in labs. They have to grow them in cell cultures because there's not enough virus to see, not enough virus particles to see. But when you look at how many virus particles are supposedly in a cell culture fluid, there are less than what is claimed to be in the bodily fluids of a person with a cold or flu. Orders of magnitude more are supposedly in our lung fluid when we're sick. Yet when they take sputum samples and they look at it directly, they don't see viruses. So what that indicates is that when they're putting all this stuff into a culture flask and mixing monkey kidney cells and antibiotics and all these other things, they're creating the effect that they're looking for. So that is a huge problem. And essentially what they're saying is proof of a virus is the breakdown of the cells that they're saying they need to infect to allow the virus to grow. But what they're really seeing is the breakdown of those cells, because they starve the cells and poison the cells and they do all kinds of things to it, which induces a cytopathic effect. The cells essentially break down and the virologists point to that effect and go, see, that was a virus that did the damage. But again, they don't control for those steps of adding in antibiotics and doing all these other things to show that those ingredients and procedures and methods aren't causing the effect they're looking for. So it doesn't follow the scientific method. It doesn't follow these scientific principles. They're not controlling for their methods. This is a huge problem that many people seem to overlook and they don't seem to address. And when it is addressed, people come up with all kinds of excuses as to why they don't need to show their working. They don't need to show their controls. They don't need to follow the scientific method. They make all kinds of excuses. And at the end of the day, science is science. Science is a method. It is a procedure. There is a strict method that needs to be followed to demonstrate cause and effect. If you do not follow that method and you do not control for each step along the way to show that what you're doing isn't confounding your results, you can't call it science.
Yeah.
So if virology wants to claim that they're doing science, they need to demonstrate it. And so far, they haven't demonstrated that.
Yeah. Wow. It just makes you sort of question so much more, doesn't it, when we hear things like that? And I remember also reading through your book how quite a lot of medical practitioners, doctors, scientists, very well credentialed and esteemed, were noting that they were even finding it difficult to differentiate the virus versus other things like exosomes.
Yeah, there's a list of like a dozen, maybe more, things inside bodily fluids and cell cultures. So they grow these viruses that are indistinguishable from a virus. They can't tell them apart. So if you can't tell it apart, if you take a cell culture sample and you look at it under an electron microscope and you see all kinds of things there and you say, they're all really similar, and they just point to an arbitrary thing and say, that's the virus. And these other things aren't the virus, they just look like they're the virus. Well, what you need to do is then take that virus that you say is the thing causing the effect, isolate it from the cell culture and expose just that virus to healthy people and see if it causes disease. They've never done that. They've never, ever done that. And they confuse all kinds of things as so-called viruses in the bodily fluids of sick people. They cannot differentiate the so-called infectious particles from things that naturally exist inside us. So yeah, there's many, many, many issues here. And this isn't something that has just been spoken about now. This has been brought up by doctors and scientists and virologists for decades and decades and decades. This was even brought up as early as the 1930s, when this idea of a virus as the cause of a cold and flu was first put forward. Doctors came out and said, hang on a minute, you guys aren't controlling for your experiments and showing you're working and demonstrating that what you're doing isn't causing the effect. So doctors have been calling this out for nearly 100 years, yet no one's ever taken the time to listen to what they're saying and prove that what they're doing in a lab actually is indicative of what's going on in nature.
Yeah. Amazing. Now, I just want to read a little excerpt from your book, which again talks a little bit about the actual virus itself. I think it was on page 62 of your book, and it says, interestingly, the word virus, derived from the Latin meaning toxin or poison, was defined in English dictionaries as a poisonous substance produced in the body as the result of some disease. The definition was only changed to a small non-cellular obligate parasites carrying non-host genetic information in the mid-1900s after so-called advances in the field of virology. So I think that's quite a pivotal something to raise, is that it was thought of many hundreds or not even hundreds of years ago that a virus was more a poison or a toxin as opposed to being a germ. Can you share us maybe with our listeners a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, viruses were, by definition, considered a toxin or a poison. So when people were exposed to a toxin or a poison, it caused damage to their tissue, and then they got symptoms, which are the healing response, right? So that constellation of specific symptoms we classify as a disease, when actually you got damaged there was tissue damage occurring first, and then the symptoms that we see is the after effect. It's the healing response, right? So that's another thing we have to sort of come to terms with here, is that we've confused what disease really is and what the cause is. Medicine was essentially saying viruses are poisons. When you get poisoned, tissue damage occurs, and then you get sick. That was, for one reason or another, they changed their perspective in the late 1800s, where they said that it wasn't a poison anymore, that it was a bacteria causing it, causing colds and flus. They believed that for 30 or 40 years that colds and flus were caused by bacteria. Now, they went through and did the experiments where they tried to make healthy people sick, and they couldn't do it by exposing them to bacteria. They couldn't do it. So then they thought, there must be something smaller than a bacteria that we can't see. So it must be a virus. They just used this term as a sort of general thing. They didn't know what they were looking for. They just defined it as a virus. They had no idea or concept of what this thing might be. They could have labeled it anything. They didn't know what it was. They went looking for it. They couldn't find it. So then they had to go and invent convoluted cell culture methodologies to demonstrate or add weight to this idea that it is a virus. And they've never sufficiently demonstrated this. So if you think about what a cold or flu is, we get symptoms of coughing and sneezing and excess mucus production, sweating, fatigue. The symptoms are the answer to the problem. The symptoms are the remedy. So when you're exposed to something like dust, you get a big whiff of dust, what does your body do? It produces mucus. You start coughing and sneezing. You're trying to expel this stuff, whatever it is. We're told that viruses, when you get infected by one of those things, or one of these things, they initiate these symptoms, and the symptoms aren't the body's attempt to get rid of the virus. The virus hijacks the body's own mechanisms of coughing and sneezing to spread it around to other people. That's what the common agreement is in the field of virology to this day. Is it really that? Or is it the body trying to expel something that it's been exposed to? Now, we know that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of things that cause flu-like illnesses that are non-viral in nature. Poisoning is one of those things. This thing, conditions called metal fume fever, dipper's flu. So when farmers go and dip their sheep in pesticides, insecticides, and they get exposed to these poisons, they get a flu. No virus required. The symptoms are there to help the body expel the poison that those farmers and people were exposed to. You get flu-like symptoms from certain medications like benzodiazepine drugs and opiate drugs. All kinds of things can cause flu-like symptoms that are accepted in medicine as non-viral causes. So, when they say or originally said that a virus is a poison, I think they had it right.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes you really think, doesn't it? That, really what is making us sick, seeing that symptoms, it's not a bad thing, and it's not meaning we have to be scared of other people around us. It's just your own body going through that purging to eliminate it. And I think I remember hearing you have often made mention, Daniel, that you believe in your personal take on things, that there are really only three main causes of disease or illness, and that's deficiency, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, deficiency, toxicity, and trauma. Obviously, there's so many components within that, but those can all manifest into different types of different symptoms, and even the cold and flu-like symptoms.
We've confused the body's natural elimination response as the disease. We've confused the symptoms as the disease. And this is not just for colds and flus. This is across the board. The signs and symptoms are not the problem. They are the answer to the problem. The damage to the tissue happens first from all kinds of things.
Mm.
The symptoms are not the problem. The symptoms are the answer to the problem. So the tissue damage occurs first, and then the body mounts a response to bring it back to homeostasis, bring it back to balance, to remedy the problem. And they are the signs and symptoms that do that. So you said that cold and flus are basically a purge, which is exactly what I think is going on. And we've confused that for the effect of some contagious infectious microorganism that spreads between groups of people who are unlucky enough to not have a strong enough immune system. Here's a really good example that might help people to understand where I'm coming from here. In late 2019, in China, where the pandemic so-called broke out, the air quality in China is not so good at the best of times. So the World Health Organization says that the currently acceptable level of air pollution should be no more than 5 micrograms per cubic meter. Let's just call it, for the sake of the discussion, 5 parts per million. No more. In China, it's usually 40 to 50 on a good day. In late 2019, a meteorological phenomenon occurred known as a temperature inversion. So what happens is during the day, the sun heats up the ground and you get a layer of hot air closest to the ground. And as that hot air rises, it takes away the air pollution with it. So it keeps that air pollution to a sort of manageable level. And in China, the pollution's bad, so it's around 40, 50 parts per million. Late 2019, a temperature inversion happened, and these are quite common. And basically what that means is that a layer of cool air settled above that layer of warm air closest to the ground. It acted like a lid. So it prevented that hot air from rising up and taking away the pollution with it. So the pollution from the cars and tire dust, brake dust, exhaust, industries, man-made pollution, essentially, couldn't escape, couldn't go away. It got trapped closer towards the ground to the point where the air pollution went in excess of 700 micrograms per cubic meter. 700. And the allowable level is 5.
Wow.
What we're talking about here is particulate matter, PM 2.5. And we know that PM 2.5 is one of the most damaging things a human being can possibly be exposed to. A level of 700 micrograms per cubic meter is akin to smoking 50, 60, 70 cigarettes in a day. So people are breathing in toxic air. They're exposed to massive amounts of pollution and they start getting respiratory symptoms. Huge numbers of people start getting sick. Now, was it because they were all exposed to a virus? Well, virology says so. They say that when this happens, viruses can adhere to the particles in the air more readily, and therefore viruses are more transmissible. Is that really what's going on, or is it the fact that people were being poisoned by the toxic air that they were breathing? I know sort of which direction I'd go in.
Yeah.
Just to put this into context, the number of people that die every year as a direct result of exposure to PM 2.5 is in excess of 10 million people a year. Now, cancer supposedly kills a lot of people. So how many people a year die of cancer? It's somewhere close to 9 million. So more people every year die from polluted air than they do of cancer. This is how bad this problem is. So again, that would explain why we see large groups of people in an area falling sick one after the other with the same symptoms. They were getting bronchitis and pneumonia and all kinds of things. These cities are heavily polluted. We were never meant to be breathing in this particulate matter. And when we do, our lungs are usually very good at expelling this stuff out. So we have a thing called mucociliary clearance, where we have these fine little hair-like, finger-like projections lining our lungs and respiratory tract that act like a broom, and they essentially bring all of that rubbish that we've been inhaling out of our lungs.
Mm-hmm.
When you get a temperature inversion happening, or even a change in temperature or humidity, that process is inhibited. So the mucociliary clearance stops. So you're continuing to breathe in all the pollution, but now your lungs can't get it out. And when that happens, the body has to compensate for the loss of its own cleansing mechanism, which is mucociliary clearance. And what it does is it sloughs off the lining of the respiratory tract. It gets rid of all those epithelial cells. It releases inflammatory mediators like bradykinin and histamine, for example. And those inflammatory mediators induce the symptoms that we know as a cold or a flu: coughing, sneezing, mucus production. And it does that to bring all of that stuff out of the lungs. This is well established in the scientific and medical literature. This is a known phenomenon that happens. So is it this that's going on? Change in temperature, change in humidity, and incapacity to continue getting all the inhaled pollution out of our lungs? Or are there microscopic invisible particles that no one's ever seen in nature or in a human being floating through the air that infect large groups of people? Which one is it? Very, very difficult to demonstrate the virus claim and the contagion claim. Far easier and far more logical to think that maybe our body's natural detoxification and elimination processes have been compromised from breathing poison and polluted air in response to the fact that there is poison and pollution in the air, compounded by a change in temperature and humidity. And I'll pass it back to you in just 1 second. Where did the word cold come from? In the medical dictionaries in the 1800s, even as early as 1920s, a cold was defined as the symptoms experienced by people when they're exposed to cold temperatures. That was what a cold was named after. The flu was named after the influence of the cold. This was in the medical literature, in the medical dictionaries. This is what it was named after. Our ancestors were giving us the answer. We just chose to discard that and go, it's got nothing to do with cold temperatures or changes in humidity, and it's got everything to do with this invisible particle that no one's ever seen.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And now I'm just sort of thinking back to early 2020 and when we were sort of seeing images on the media, obviously from China, and with this sort of one focus being directed towards a virus. And that was the only messaging we were receiving if we look at it through the media. And it was certainly quite relentless, let's face it. They weren't they weren't talking about any other discussions like as possible causes, like you're saying, as pollution. It was very, and also I feel when we're talking about the causes of death over the years and fatalities and stuff, I feel because also they were just focusing on one thing. To me, the numbers didn't feel quite right because there was no comparison to, okay, there's this many people dying of this virus supposedly, but tell me what it is in comparison to cancer deaths. Tell me what it is in comparison to those that have died from respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, because the numbers, as overwhelming as they may have appeared at that time, really, if they're not put into context in comparison, to me, they're just numbers. That was, to me, where things just weren't, I guess, sitting right and starting to make me question a little bit of things as well. So, yeah, thanks.
Well, Audra, I was just going to mention the flu disappeared. 0 cases of flu. Yet we had this massive spike of this new respiratory illness. So was there really a new illness, or was there a reclassification of an illness that was already there? People are still getting sick as they always had with colds and flus. They were just now being reclassified.
Yeah. And people would have still been dying of these other different types of conditions, obesity, cardiovascular disease, all this that couldn't have stopped. But there just it wasn't seemed to be this focus on it, which obviously puts people in a bit of that fear scenario. And then when we're in that fearful state, we tend to not be able to make proper judgments with things. Our critical analysis tends to go out of the window. So quite interesting discussion. So
I also just wanted to bring this point up because I think it's really important, because people may say we didn't have pollution in Australia around that time. We didn't have higher amounts of pollution in all different areas. So how do you explain that? I mentioned earlier about the nocebo effect, being told that you're going to experience something and you believe it to be true. We believed that there was something going around because we were being bombarded by a relentless media campaign telling us what symptoms to experience, when we would experience them, how long we would experience the symptoms for, which location it was now. Oh, it's coming here.
That's right. Yeah.
Have this mass media campaign spreading fear and spreading this idea and putting it into people's minds about what's going on. That in itself could have been enough to create a pandemic based on fear and stress and taking away people's human rights and doing all these things that people have never been exposed to before. And they manifest the symptoms in their mind as a mass psychogenic illness, social contagion. We know that this is a real phenomenon. This has been, again, documented in the medical literature. So one example I can remember that I covered in the book was in, I think, 2014 or around this time in New Zealand. A antidepressant medication came off patent. So they released a generic drug. And in New Zealand, you can advertise about drugs and medication. You can't in Australia, but you can in New Zealand. And it started putting out warnings in the news, on TV, on the radio, on the newspapers, on social media, about the side effects of this new generic drug. If you're taking this generic drug, you need to be careful because these side effects are really prevalent for people taking this particular drug. And they only mentioned about half a dozen of them. Interestingly, they started getting an influx of reports from people taking this drug saying, I've got the symptoms, the side effects that are reported on the news. I need help. They have to go in and see their doctor and get a medication review and all this sort of stuff. They had many, 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 many adverse effects. A huge spike. Interestingly, there were dozens of side effects on the package insert for this drug. Dozens and dozens. But people didn't experience and report those symptoms. They only reported the symptoms that they were told about on the news. So now what happens when you hear a news report saying you're going to get coughing, you're going to get sneezing, you're going to get loss of taste and smell, you're going to get this and this and this and this, it's going to last for this long. We know that it happens with other situations. So why couldn't it happen when there's a relentless media campaign that people are bombarded with 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? They are stripped of their rights to go about free movement, locked in their homes, and they've got nothing else to do except being in front of the TV and the computer, watching all this unfold, hearing this message over and over and over again, and lo and behold, they get the symptoms. So, I mean, again, there are so many alternative explanations. And look, I might be wrong. There might be virus out there. I don't discount that idea entirely. It's very, very possible, but I would need to be shown evidence for that. And I think as long as all these alternative explanations exist, people deserve and they are entitled to be told that these are possibilities, but we never hear about them. We only ever hear the virus story. And if we were given all of these alternative explanations, it would be far more difficult for a government body or a medical body to come along and say, right, in the name of public health, we're going to do X, Y, and Z to you because we have to protect you from a virus. And people comply with that because they don't understand there are all these other plausible things that could be actually going on. If it was an environmental thing, if it was a change in temperature and humidity or mass psychogenic illness, no one's going to want to comply with the mandates of masking up and doing social distancing and locking themselves down because there is no justification for it.
So that brings me to another question then that I wanted to throw out there is in regards to testing, because there'll be people listening to this conversation and they'll say, yeah, but Daniel, I went and got the test and they told me I had, the C. And I had it a few times. They, it told me I had it over and over. What's your thoughts on that?
Again, we could go down a long discussion about this whole testing thing.
Yeah.
To keep it really simple is the test was never validated. It was never validated. They never had anything to validate the test against. They created the test. They even admit this. The Corman and Drosten paper, which came out like a week or two after the first reported cases in China, which created this PCR test, they even admit in there that they created it in the absence of a sample of an isolated virus. They had nothing to validate the test against. So if you haven't validated the test, it is absolutely and utterly meaningless. I mean, you can make all the arguments you want about the genome and all this stuff. The fact of the matter is you have to have the thing first. You have to have the gold standard. You've got to have the thing that you're trying to test, to develop the test, to test for it. If you don't have it, how do you know what you're developing a test for? They never had the thing. They admitted they didn't have the thing. It's not me saying it. They said it. Therefore, the test is invalid.
The ramifications of that are enormous. I think if most of us were aware of that at the time. And I think something people forget, or the general public sort of forget, that there are these false, besides even getting to what you just spoke about, but the false positives and false negatives and, vice versa. There's always that to it as well, that just because the timing of particular tests, when they're done, they can get different results. We can talk about blood glucose levels in that regard. Getting tested in the morning can give a different test in the afternoon. Like, there's so many things that can go into interplay. And that's just a side note to an addition to what you just said. But I think it certainly should make us a little bit, moving forward, a little bit more curious, I suppose, about some of the things that get brought to us to make us, I guess, follow certain procedures moving forward. But before we go, Daniel, is there any parting comments that you'd like to add, I guess, especially for the medical professionals that might be listening, doctors, nurses, paramedics, and so forth? Because I think for them, being on the front line, so to speak, this is probably going to be for them the hardest to wrap their head around what the information that you've been sharing.
People need to look at this with an open mind. I've simply presented the information as I've found it. People can read it and make up their own minds. It doesn't matter to me what people think or believe. They are entitled to their own opinions and perspectives. But I think at least take the time to understand the information that all of these things are based on, or the lack thereof. I will say that we did some very simple data analysis on the experiments that we found. So over 200 experiments we found where they tried to make healthy people sick. The modal contagion rate, the most frequently occurring result across those 200 experiments, was a modal contagion rate of 0. The most frequently occurring result was no contagion. So what that means is, if you're a scientist or a researcher and you go out and you put sick people together in a room with healthy people, the most likely result that you will get is no contagion. That is a really big problem considering we're told that colds and flus are passed so easily and readily via fleeting contact on the street. This should be a very simple thing to demonstrate. They haven't demonstrated it. Another finding from the book is there was a total of, across those 200 experiments, there was a total of zero double-blind or even single-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials demonstrating contagion. Zero. Now, if you're a health professional listening to this, you will know that there are things called systematic reviews that look at an area of research. They take all of that research and analyze it in its totality to find out if there is a cause and effect relationship going on. They have never done this for any contagious illnesses in respect to human transmission experiments. They've never taken all of the human transmission experiments that have been done for mumps, measles, chickenpox, cold, flu, nothing, none of them, and analyzed them in their totality and seen, is there a phenomenon called contagion for the cold and flu or measles or mumps or whatever? They've never, ever done that. Now, the reason that I think they've never done it is because what they would find is zero contagion. My book is the first book that I know of that has actually gone through and done this. And again, I've had a number of medical doctors, microbiologists, virologists, PhD psychologists, a team of people looking at all of this, assisting with this to make sure that everything, the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed. Those facts alone, the modal contagion rate, the absence of any controlled trials demonstrating contagion, and the absolute lack of any systematic review evaluating human transmission experiment, the results of human transmission experiments, should ring alarm bells to people, just at the very least. It's like, that's really curious. I wonder why. Go and look at the literature yourselves and come to your own conclusion. I think that's the best way moving forward for people who are listening to this podcast. Don't take my word for anything. Go and do your own research and look at this yourself.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty powerful way to end the discussion, and I certainly know that I'm now very open mind to everything and have no attachment to anything, because I think we're both on that journey of just wanting to get to the truth. So thank you, Daniel. This has been a really profound discussion. I've really been looking forward to getting hold of you to have this talk. I wanted to make sure that I've read your book, and I highly recommend anyone listening to get hold of Daniel's book, especially if you're a health professional. Obviously, to keep that having that open mind moving forward. But for anyone wanting to learn more even about your book, Daniel, or more about your work, how can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, sure. You can contact me through my website, www.humanley.com, humanley.com. A lot of information on there, lots of podcasts with many, many doctors and health professionals around the world who are sharing their thoughts and perspectives on a wide range of topics. And for anyone interested in getting the book, you can also go to my website, click on books in the bar at the top of the page, or you can go to Amazon, type in "Can You Catch a Cold?" and it's available as a hardcover and paperback. Will be available as an ebook in the coming weeks and months, and a audiobook version will be recorded by one of my colleagues, Dr. Sam Bailey, who played an instrumental role in helping write this book. She also wrote the foreword, so she'll be narrating the audiobook, which will hopefully be out in the next sort of 3 to 6 months.
Excellent. I like that. It's definitely gives people a few different options to digest the information from an audio perspective. But yeah, thank you, Daniel, for allowing me to have this discussion with you and for allocating some of your time. This really has just been such an enlightening conversation. I feel so blessed and grateful that I managed to cross paths with you at university while studying, because you are quite a phenomenal teacher. You really do help to make people think. Like, as you said, you're not telling us what to think, you're teaching us how to think for ourselves. And that truly is, in my opinion, a gift. Not everybody has that, and which makes you a phenomenal teacher. And I know that you're going to be certainly helping a lot of people through the book and the work that you've done so far.
Thank you so much, Audra. And I'm very humbled by the kind words that you've just imparted on me. Thank you for taking the time to have me on to your podcast. I hope that people listening have gained some insight, or at the very least, it's just made them ask some questions which they can now go forward and answer for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Audra.